Hello, and welcome back to Parley, this show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, PNGRZ has requested some discussion about what I'm going to call, is multiplayer magic able to be fun? PNGRZ, you said, Zandy, I challenge you to a parlay in response to a dilemma that I was originally posed by a friend during a discussion about building commander decks for Magic the Gathering. Here's the question. Are there any instances that can't upset someone at a table in a game of Commander, that cannot upset someone at a table in a game of Commander? Usually common instance like removal and counters, PNGRZ says, tend to target somebody, and that somebody tends not to like it. But are there any cards or kinds of cards that do a particularly good job of avoiding that feeling? And you've got a little spoiler out part that is, I assume, an answer from your discussion. You said, curious to hear where your thoughts go with this. Oh, there's a lot. You could begin this parlay by trying to answer this question the way I would interpret it, which I'm going to spend a lot of time in a few minutes making the point that I don't really know what you mean by can't upset someone. That's not really knowable. So instead I'm going to do something else ludicrously complicated because that's why you paid me $9 if you didn't want that. I don't know what people expect from parlay besides that. Because I don't not like it when somebody counters my spell or kills my creature. I don't not like it because I went to the table expecting that. I want people to do that. My play group or the social contract or my assumptions about Magic, a lot of all those things, have put me in a position where I don't find that unpleasant. And to be clear, I don't just mean that I'm being a good sport and I won't like act upset, but secretly it wasn't the best for me. I mean, I am happier because somebody did that, because I came to the table wanting interaction. I want to make plays and feel like when something gets through, it's because I truly succeeded at an element of strategy, not because my opponents simply had nothing and were unable to stop me. And so when something does go through, my ideal experience would be if I had sufficient cause to know that people had removal or interaction, but they chose not to use it. Which is why I like seeing when they do use it, because then I think, oh, they metagamed and calculated the way I was, and they chose to use their interaction here. They chose to do that. They could have chosen not to. They had it, and they chose to do it because they felt like my play was sufficiently threatening that it needed to be stopped, which is fun. I succeeded. That's the experience I wanted. Now, that's not the only way you might attempt to have fun playing Magic. Let's leave it at that for now. I'm now going to go on an analytical diatribe about whether or not I think you can have fun Magic other ways, which might sound like a crazy claim. Like, of course people play Magic other ways, and of course it's fun, but I don't know if I agree. I think there's at least one other way that people have actual fun playing Magic. If you're thinking, do we really need to do this existentialism thing? We absolutely do. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute and explain what I mean by that. And I think with that method, I have in mind an answer that should, in my opinion, make it fun to play Magic with lots of interaction, with instants and stuff, for anyone maybe. But there's some problems. There's some significant problems. And it's occurred to me that I think you and some listeners might prefer if I just led with that. So I will. But it's not going to make sense why I think that this is the only maybe way to do it until I explain this other bit. So just know that going in. Maybe you don't care. It's fine. Here we go. This is my answer. And then I'm going to show my work afterward. I don't think that playing an arms race where it's assumed that everything will be stopped and everything can be stopped and people just kind of machine gun each other with interaction until somebody happens to be out and then somebody wins. I personally don't think that is perfect. I'm going to go on to interrogate whether that, basically CEDH or competitive Elder Dragon Highlander, competitive commander, I'm going to go on to interrogate whether that is fun. I have my concerns, and I'll explain what I mean by whether it's fun. That might sound like a matter of opinion, but that's not what I mean. I'll talk about it in a sec. I think the problem is that because everyone has so much hyper-efficient interaction, I feel as if it sort of boils down to whether you have the interaction or not. At the end, you have a ton of it, and everybody uses a ton of it because everybody has a bunch of cards that win the game in 1 or 2 plays. But then eventually someone is just kind of out, and it looks like someone has, you know, calculated that people will run out of resources. But in truth, somebody thought that someone had more or less or whatever interaction than they did, and they were just kind of wrong. Like the luck of the draw happened that they actually didn't get that, and that's why the game was decided. So I think that's one thing over here. And then over here, we have Magic with basically no interaction. This is the approach that most people take, in my experience. 90% of Commander, people play with very little, but still some interaction. And the interaction they play is not that different than the interaction that the CEDH crowd plays. They play Fierce Guardianship, but just only Fierce Guardianship, something like that. That's a little extreme, but you get my point, I think. They play still infinitely good interaction. Still really powerful instance that would make you really salty or whatever, if that's how you feel. They just play much less of them. They play a lot less of that. I don't think that this is ideal either, because it creates a situation where the game is defined by players not interacting, but occasionally you still get blown out of doing some play you wanted to do. And there's this feeling like, well, what the heck? We set up a whole game where I expected to be able to do my thing, but then you blew up my creature at the last second. And because there's so little interaction, that often leads to the only very few times a player gets hit with interaction, that player just loses. So like people mostly do their own thing. And to be honest, this doesn't appeal to me. I'm going to talk about that more later. It's kind of like playing solitaire. Your opponents aren't interfering with you and interacting that much. I'll go on to make a point about how I think that defines Magic as a unique game, that players do interact. But because there's still a little bit of interaction, unless people play literally no interaction, which is kind of impossible, someone is going to get blown out by like the 1 or 2 pieces of removal that will be in the game. Do you see what I mean? So personally, I am going to go on to describe how I think both of those are, in some objectifiable way, not fun in the long term. They don't really work as gameplay experiences. But I do think there's something that does. The key, as I've described it from these 2 examples, is that you need to have a lot of interaction, but the game isn't ideally anyway, decided by running out of interaction, principally because that's ultimately random. If you want the game to end because you did something good, then the game has to have interaction, and you have to have it in a way where you don't run out, basically. Which might sound like, how? Like, what? And yet, I would also argue that most people do to some extent want to do their own thing. If we didn't, we could just play poker, which is fine, by the way. We could just play poker. We could just play something that doesn't allow us to kind of customize our experience. But I gather that people want that because they're playing Magic the Gathering Commander, where they can pick a commander, have an 100-card deck that's all singleton, and they can pick the art they want on the card and get different sleeves and stuff. And I like that. Like, I enjoy that thing. I would argue it doesn't make that much sense to be playing Magic rather than some other game if you want that, if you don't want that. You can definitely get a version of the solitaire thing. It's okay if you like that, but I don't, and that's what I'm calling it. I'll talk about it more later. Or the CEDH thing. I don't like that. It's okay if you do, but I'm calling it CEDH for now. You could get those experiences playing other games, but not necessarily with the, you could argue just cosmetic, but it's a little bit of gameplay fiddling, right? Customization of the experience that you get from Commander. So I think that the way to do it, the way to solve the conundrum, is to play a strategy that includes synergistic removal that is just not very efficient. So I'll give you an example. One of the decks in my pod of Commander decks is Cadena, Slinking Sorcerer. She is Sultai, green, blue, black, morph enabler. She lets you play a morph creature every turn, give your creatures flash for free, you face down, so you don't pay the cost of 3 mana to play it face down. And you draw a card basically once around as you use morphs. This is great. A lot of morph creatures are super inefficient. They have some good effect when they flip up, but it costs so much mana to play them face down, they're super vulnerable, and then you flip them face up and get the effect, that in practice they're infinitely inefficient to the point of you not even being able to use them creatures. Now, Cadena helps upchuck that. She removes the cost to play them face down, so you can always just like set a trap card. And that's a very unique gameplay experience too. There's not a lot of things in Magic like that, where you put on the table a card that is basically in your hand. So I think that's cool. Again, very customizable gameplay experience. And she also helps replace your cards if your vulnerable 2/2 morph creatures just get killed, because she draws you cards. Because she has card advantage on her, she also helps remove the fallacy of people just killing your commander and then your entire deck is a pile of no synergy. I try to make all the commanders in the pod have some solution for, we're assuming you're going to kill my stuff. So what do I do about that? The deck is meant to work when you kill my stuff. It's meant to not make sense if you don't destroy my stuff. You're meant to kill my stuff. But not infinitely much, because the morph creatures that are interactive are now viable but still inefficient removal or interaction. There's a lot of morph creatures that have an ability when they flip face up that is basically like counter a spell or redirect a spell or something. Like they're effectively like you played a normal instant. They are an instant, basically. Obviously, when you say are there any instants, you mean interaction, basically. But they cost more mana than if you just played like the good version of that. Now, you get a creature, and they have synergy with Cadena, but as I established, I think the synergy with Cadena basically just shores them up and makes them like, you can actually use this card. It doesn't really make them better than playing Force of Will. Like, you would still rather have a free counterspell if you wanted a purely good card. But these will work. They are playable. You will have the mana to use one. You just can't use very many of them. And this is the trick. You can play a lot of them. You just won't be able to actually cast all of them. You will always have removal. You just won't always be able to use removal. And when people see that you're relatively out of mana, they will be able to make plays with the educated knowledge that you actually can't interact with them using every single thing at your disposal. You might save something that costs less mana, but you'll only have so many of those. You have removal. You always have removal, basically. They know you have removal. They always know you have removal. When you do something or they do something and it goes uncountered or unkilled, everyone at the table goes, he let that happen. Like, why did he let that happen? And it's a strategy game, and yet you can't stop everything, even though you could stop any individual thing. And personally, I think that's the ticket. Your strategy is fused with interaction. The interaction is playable but relatively inefficient. It costs a lot of mana, basically. And your deck plans to be interfered with. This combination of factors will yield a deck that I believe will provide mostly everyone who likes Magic with a fun experience, provided the deck's power level matches up to the playgroup's power level, which is very hard and really a topic for another time. I have found the experience that they often end up in a medium power range, but that is incredibly difficult to objectify and well outside the scope of this question, so I hope you don't think it's me copping out by me saying, I don't know how to express that. The decks are a 6. How about that? I don't know. I honestly don't. But if their power level was increased and the philosophy remained the same, you'd basically have a CEDH deck. And if the power level was decreased, but the philosophy remained the same, you'd basically have a more interactive than usual, very casual or pre-made deck, like the commander decks that they sell out of the box. So I believe the deck that results it doesn't look unusual, but it's built with a philosophy that will make it enduringly fun. It makes the game into a real strategy game, in other words. I personally think that this is the ticket to make it fun. So now I'm going to go into great detail about why I think that, and hopefully I've at least front-loaded what I think is the answer. I'll quickly give you a few other examples of commanders that I've done this thing with. It actually might be a little difficult for me to think of them off the top of my head, but I'll give you a few examples of decks in my pod. Now, some of these I've gone out of my way to pick maybe a less powerful strategy that is uniquely suited to this format. Like it's built with the philosophy that will make it highly interactive, But because it is going to be interactive enough, it doesn't particularly need to be really powerful. The strategy game will work with a relatively wide range of power levels, and I wanted to make sure to include various options for types of decks in the pod. So I'll give you another example. I've got a deck that's Kytheon Mono White Control. I call it Post-Apocalyptic Control. The theme of the deck is that there's a bunch of Gideon Planeswalkers, right? Now, Gideon Planeswalkers generally have an ability where they can become an indestructible creature on your turn, and there's a lot of them, and there's a few Gideon-enabling cards as well. A few cards that get better if you play Gideon Planeswalkers. And Kytheon lets you play a Gideon Planeswalker as your commander, because he flips the one. Kytheon is also very low to the ground. You can often get him online really early. So it plays a ton of utility creatures, lots of interaction. White is great at recurring those creatures. Kytheon flips and becomes a Gideon Planeswalker when you attack with 3 creatures, basically, including him. And the white utility creatures are creatures that could attack. They're not really intended to, but they can. They enable him. You can see that this is another example of a strategy where the synergy between the cards is interaction. The way you play lots of interaction cards happens to be a way you can enable the commander or the deck's strategy. Eventually, the deck is going to play a lot of board wipes. It plays lots of other interaction too, but also a lot of board wipes. It is one of the most control-y decks in the pod. It's even got like a counterspell or two, a very janky one. And the idea is that you can wipe the board with, Wrath of God or whatever, and all your Gideon Planeswalkers are immortal, untouched. Not particularly damaging, but they'll hurt your opponents if you kill all their stuff. And so people know that is coming, but what can you do? Counter every single board wipe? You can't, because we made sure that all the interaction is relatively more expensive. But can you get a gap, an opening to attack between the pulses of board wipes? If somebody counters 1 or maybe 2 turns in a row they get countered? Yes, you can. And that creates the in against the deck. So there's a very clear, you might say flaw, but really it's only because of the philosophy of the format. The deck is built to be as good as it can be with that philosophy. And a mono white control is already a relatively underpowered format unless you play Staxy cards. But I hope you can see how it's meant to work. It's a strategy that plays to the strengths of itself in some ways. It's perfectly functional. You'll be doing things that further your own game plan while interfering with other people's. Just relatively mana inefficient things that do that. You see what I mean? Your play for the turn will be you set up like a Wrath of God pulse and your Gideons go into attack, but somebody else had a flash creature saved that taps them down or whatever. Next turn, you'll go for the board wipe again, but somebody will counter it, and you'll have prepared an additional play where you play, a hate bear or some kind of interfering creature that prevents your one opponent from attacking with all their stuff because they have to pay a tax when they attack you with each creature. But then that gets killed by another opponent, and you get alpha striked. Oh no. But then you have Brave the Elements to make some of your creatures immune to... And everybody's looking behind their cards, playing a game of poker, kind of, but with their own chosen customized strategies. I have a bunch of these. Again, we have gotten into it a little bit in the past, but that is the philosophy they're built under. Now, why? Why do I think that that is the only way it can be fun? What is wrong with the competitive scene? Well, I kind of explained earlier, but the reasoning to dig into it more is that I feel with so much super efficient removal, it changes the game from being about waiting for someone to be out of it to waiting for someone to randomly not draw it, basically. They're not going to run out of mana, they're going to run out of free counterspells. And then the game is going to end in a way that feels on the surface as if somebody calculated when they could go for their big play. But in reality, it was actually mostly random whether that would succeed. It was just because this player didn't draw, the whatever, another free counterspell. Again, I don't necessarily think that's a morally wrong way to play Magic. I think that a lot of people look at that crowd and they think that that crowd is all about making nobody have any fun. They're misunderstood, much like people who drink black coffee, as doing something in the really stupid way of doing it, rather than a potentially really fun way of doing it. That scene I kind of set before of everybody with their poker hand of cards, a fierce grip of interaction to fire at each other, and then one person tries to make a play, Thassa's Oracle would win them the game, and pow, 5 counterspells go off. Like, it can be really cool. I just personally think it is actually less interactive than a somewhat lower power level of Magic with a lot of interaction, but just less powerful interaction. It's not bad or wrong just because I don't like it, but I hope you can see how I do think that there is a difference in the game design of those two experiences, and that one of them has a perk over the others. I do think there's something more interactive or more of an actual strategy game about one where you can see roughly how much mana people have, rather than it being like, I wonder if he randomly drew 5 removal spells. I don't personally feel like there's a lot you can do. You know what I mean? Like, they have 4 too. You're just wondering if they have 5. I know a lot of people, most of the Magic community, kind of views that as being something they wouldn't enjoy. And I'm here to say they don't know that. Like, a lot of people might really enjoy competitive EDH. I think that it has many problems, and the only one isn't this kind of removal randomness thing. Maybe people who play a lot of it don't think that's a problem. Maybe it isn't a problem. I only have a little bit of experience watching that format. I just personally think that it works out, at least on paper, that you should be able to get the same benefits of that experience with a relatively lower power level here. With my philosophy of playing still a lot of removal, a lot of interaction, but less efficient removal. Now, the problem, and we'll get back to this at the end, is that there isn't really any way to decide what power level exactly those decks should be. My only solution for now has been have the same person build them all, which even that kind of doesn't work, but you can buff them as a group as well. One way to do it could be to let everybody build their own decks, but you buff and debuff or change decks as a group. That could also maybe work. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but acknowledge that for all of the advantages I'm saying my approach has, the CEDH crowd has one big advantage that mine doesn't, which is that you can just use their banned list or basically allow everything. And it's impossibly expensive, and there's some other problems or whatever, but at least we kind of have an agreed upon power level, right? Like, that's a huge benefit that I lose by doing things this way. I feel that this isn't really an answer to the question unless it's understood why people mostly don't do this, and why I feel like it's a better trade to have this problem instead of that problem, because that's all this is. We're just trading some advantages for others. Now turning to the people who play, I rather rudely called it solitaire. A lot of people play Commander in a way, or they talk about playing Commander in a way, that makes it sound like they just want to play by themselves. They just want to do their thing and have it work, and then somebody wins. And that doesn't sound fun to me. I don't really understand why that would be fun. I'm now going to get into some really harsh things. They're not bad. I think a lot of people feel an experience of enjoying that. When they set up a game night and they do that, they have fun. Their friends are fun. They're having fun with their friends. They have Magic as an occasion to do that thing. And nothing particularly adversarial is happening at that table playing Magic. Nothing horrible is happening to anyone. I just think it's not an especially interesting game environment, which is fine. Like, that's fine. I don't see how that's worth it. Like, for me, I have things that I feel like are a really interesting game environment, and I'm going to enjoy my friends' company either way, so why not have the game, I don't know, have some more bite, is I guess how I feel. But you might not want that. Now, to be honest, I suspect Pingers, maybe you do have this type of playgroup. So I really don't mean to be critical. Neither do I intend to sugarcoat things, so I hope you'll accept my honesty and how I honestly do not judge or lament people playing that way. I'm just explaining why I prefer this. I hope that's okay, because I'm going to do it anyway. Again, I personally feel that a lot of the time, those people maybe actually would enjoy more interaction if it wasn't endless interaction. Again, if it wasn't like you're playing a spell to counter my spell and you have really no less resources than you did before you countered my spell. It feels less strategy gamey to a lot of people too. And I don't think it's reasonable for people to go through tournament Magic to learn how to counterplay people and a little bit count cards and that whole stuff, where it will feel more interactive, right? Like they played Force of Will and did this thing and they still have like 7 cards in their hand. They actually have less resources, but it doesn't feel like it, right? Like unless you have a lot of experience playing competitively. On the other hand, if I morph up my creature that for 4 mana counters your spell, you see I just tapped half my mana. If you know, because you've talked to me prior, because you listened to this parlay, that my deck only contains ways to stop you, where I have to tap a medium amount of mana, you can see how much energy I have to stop you, roughly. There's still a little mystery, and like maybe I have the 2 morph cards in my deck that can counter a spell or redirect a spell for 2 mana or something. But if I have no mana, I have no mana. You know what I mean? Like there's still a way for you to feel like you have very finite resources in a way I can see. This might sound like it kind of doesn't matter, or like it's a casual filter thing to some people. I'd like you to leave that aside. Let's accept that for a lot of players, that is way more readable, that is way more interactable. And I would reckon that people who are enjoying playing Magic with, I kind of think of it as like everything on the table, that might be a good solution. It might be a way for them to enjoy interaction, something that is one of the things that makes Magic unique and a beautiful game in some ways. I think we can all accept that you're probably not just going to tell all the players that they can't play any interaction, or that they can't play instants or something. Not that that would do it anyway. You're probably not going to, you could do that. I wouldn't, I doubt people will do that. So if we're not going to do that, maybe a way of being able to use interaction that kind of does solve the underlying problem is better. I'm not trying to suggest that it's bad to want to do your deck's thing. I do think that one of the major problems with my approach over here that you kind of gain back by doing the, I hate saying the solitaire approach, I feel like I'm being mean now. But anyway, the let's just say the less competitive, no, the less interactable, the use less interaction version. One of the major things you lose by doing mine instead, and CEDH, is that the realm of decks that are, we have to say in air quotes, viable, we'll come back to in a sec, has been greatly narrowed. Even if you only use my model instead of the CEDH model, the number of strategies where you can play a bunch of interaction that's only of moderate efficiency and cost mana and is synergistic with your strategy is limited. Like there's not a particularly huge number of commanders that check all those boxes, that are going to survive getting killed a bunch and play a lot of removal, but it's a medium interaction and they'll keep up with all the other decks that are doing that thing. There's not that many decks. There's not an ocean of variety of strategies. It seems like there is to me in my play group because I'm the only person doing this, right? But if this was a common thing, we would see a relatively less broad metagame. That would be less interesting to some people. You would have less choice about what you played. But I think you would still have a lot of choice. And for that matter, nobody actually knows the metagame for this. You don't have to follow all of my cockamamie rules. It's not that limited. Like I still feel like that's not a crazy trade-off. I personally feel like, I hope that's enough for people to give it a try, build a deck with this philosophy, probably work together on a deck built with this philosophy. Remember, having some secret card in your deck that blows everybody out is, you can still do that for one thing, kind of, we'll get back to it in a second, but you want people to know there's a lot of interaction in your deck. That's the whole point, like, is that people don't get blown out by something they don't see coming. I hope my point is well taken from before, that in the less interaction environment that I was so awfully saying is solitaire-like before, you've got this problem where, like, people still play some amount of interaction. Like, let's say everybody just buys the pre-constructed decks, right? They still have, again, my example before was like, they still have Fierce Guardianship, they just only have that. So one time in the game, after everyone's gotten used to not getting their stuff interfered with, somebody gets blown out by an unstoppably efficient counterspell, and it feels terrible. Like, that's not a better experience. Like, having less interaction doesn't solve the problem. You can have no interaction, or you can have a ton of interaction, but then if you have a ton of really efficient interaction, you get that problem, which is why I feel like this is the only real solution. Now, we've talked a lot. I feel like I explained in my bit. I wanted to quickly highlight having the super secret tech. as I said before, I think one of the biggest problems with my approach is that exactly what power level we are referring to here is pretty vague. How much is acceptable for the removal to be relatively inefficient, right? Now, personally, I think just by avoiding staples, or another really good rule is make sure it's on a stick. That's a rule. You can play Simic creatures that have flash and are a counterspell, but like they're 4 mana, you know? And in one-on-one Magic, those cards can be pretty brutal, but in Commander, I don't know, man. I don't think those cards are that bad. Like, you can play your Mystic Snake and your Frilled Mystic, is that what it's called? Basically both 4 mana Simic counterspell creatures. And that, I think, is a good kind of medium ground. What is the cost of this effect if it's on a stick? You could say it that way. But you can see how that's not perfect. It's not. There is an element here that doesn't really feel capturable, that I'm not really sure what you would do about, I think of it as the Tainted Strike problem. Mm-hmm. If we're playing this kind of Magic and you get in with your creature, but I've got like 40 life, other people on the board could have anything, and your 10/10 will not kill me unless they have Tainted Strike, unless they have some super obscure card that's very mana efficient. It usually might not accomplish much, but in this one scenario, I can do everything right, and this card deletes me from existence. Like, I instead didn't strategize because this one card. That's a place where I might just ban the card. I heavily advocate ignoring the official ban list and having your own house ban list. Or you could score your decks based on salt scores. You could go to edhrec.com and check if any of the cards in your deck have a high salt score and not use them. I don't think that's a good method, but it's a method, and having a house ban list is also a method with various trade-offs. I saw something interesting that it doesn't really solve the problem, but it's a pretty interesting method for some aspects of Magic. It's a little tool that lets you evaluate how they call it hipster, but basically how uncommon it is for this commander to run that card. How hip a card is. I think the term hipster has enough problems as it is, but in any case, it evaluates how uncommon that card is, and very importantly, in this commander deck. I don't think it's bad to play commonly accepted cards. They might be common because they're fun. They might be common because they're efficient, and efficiency gives you resources which can lead to fun. That's not bad, but it might be fun to play them in decks where they're not just busted. You know what I mean? And you can kind of check that. Not everybody making decks is perfectly efficient, but because of how often people use online resources, it actually is pretty common for people to make very relatively efficient decks. So you could try it. I don't think that on its own really does the job, but you could look it up, look for the Magic the Gathering hipster, what's it called? I'll just link it in the description, I'm sorry. We don't really need to do this right now, I'll just link it. I don't know what it's called. But it'll be linked in the description. Again, that doesn't really evaluate the power level of a deck. You could argue it doesn't really accomplish anything, but it does allow you to have some method by which to score strategies. I've been emphasizing how mine has a kind of nebulous power level, but let's be real, pretty much all ways of playing Commander have a gigantic problem with evaluating power level. So it's not like this is a huge problem with my methodology. I'm just trying to say it remains a problem with my methodology, and your fun could still be undone by somebody with a deck that follows my philosophy, but there's just no way to define like what relatively inefficient removal is. I do think the on a stick thing is a great metric. I also think it's useful to look to, there's things to learn from CEDH and from the less interaction crowd, right? The less interaction crowd, I believe, teaches us a bit about like basic combat in Magic is fun, can be fun. Like it can be fun to just like turn some creatures sideways, you know? If you play all your stuff on a stick, it costs more mana and you like use the combat step, which I'm not saying it's bad if you don't, but I think a lot of people, that's part of what they're looking for. Being honest, I think a big aspect of this parlay is that some of the people who really think they don't like a lot of interaction, it's not really the interaction that's the problem. I feel like I've been basically saying that, but not outright said it. And in fact, you should put a lot of interaction in. It doesn't really solve the problem to try to cut down on that. You should instead change other things and focus on what it is you want out of that experience and whether you really need to exclude other things for that to work. I think in a lot of cases, it's actually better to include that stuff. And it's futile to get people to try to stop anyway. Like, again, what are you going to do? Tell people they can't play any interactive spells, no instance, also no creatures with flash, and no, you can't do anything on anyone else's turn. Like, you could do that. You can't use any activated abilities either on other people's turn. No, it's not practical. And I would reckon people, when I start saying it this way, people go, well, I don't want that. It kind of sounded like you did until recently, but I agree. You don't want that. I don't know who I'm talking to here. Because that isn't really the problem. The problem isn't really that the interaction is there. The problem is that it's brutally efficient and it doesn't do anything except stop you from doing something. That's a thing. Now, a few closing thoughts before I click on your spoilered out bit. I talked a lot because I had a ton to say about this. That's what it seemed like you were interested in, but I'm quite keen to see what you have to say too. I'm curious if it's at all related to what I talked about. But a closing thought before we move on. There's kind of like a separate problem here that is like combos, basically. People winning in a way that is less linear. Like, there's a concern that if you play less efficient interaction, combo decks thrive because all that makes a strategy good is overwhelming mana if your removal is less efficient. Now, I'm not sure this is a huge deal. I feel like if you have a table full of people that have these decks and one player plays a combo deck and you all know what that deck is, aside from the very first time they play it, you all know that you need to wait for a pulse where they go for it, and then you can counter them a few times in a turn by relatively cooperating so you don't all lose. If your table doesn't do that level of politicking, or another problem, if your table is in a situation where that player is going to feel ganged up on, I feel things get a bit complicated. Like, I feel like there isn't really a meta problem there, but if your problem is just that people feel like when somebody kills my creature, they're picking on me or something, to be honest, I feel like Magic isn't going to work for that group. Like, that doesn't seem that workable. I feel like you need to be playing with people that are mature enough to understand that it's not a slight against you if I try to play the strategy game and it happens to interfere with your thing. That being said, I do think that playing cards that are proactive, like they're a body, for example, I said basically they're on a stick, it's a creature. Playing cards like that to interact with people, I wonder if would make those people feel a little less bad. Like, this is my deck's way of moving forward. I just chose things that respect my opponents as well. I wonder if framed that way, those players would have less of a problem with it. To be absolutely honest with you, I think it's a bit immature to just be bothered by somebody destroying your thing if that is a thing the group has discussed. Like, if you did all the stuff I said before, and everybody knows, like, we're going to play a good amount of interaction, and then one person plays a combo deck to try to exploit the mana thing, but then people rightly strategize to make sure they don't combo off, and then the combo deck will be kind of bad. Maybe this is harsh, but I would blame the combo player for not seeing that relatively obvious metagame situation coming. You know what I mean? Basically, if your group doesn't counterplay, you, the combo player, will always win. So why is that fun? Don't bother. And if your group does counterplay, your deck will be terrible because they'll make your whole deck do nothing in one round. So it won't work very well. Why bother? And that metagaming perspective puts you in a position where you want to play a deck that wins by interacting with other people rather than just flying through the game at the end. Only because you don't go in the other direction and say, well, we should play cheaper interaction, which is how you get to CEDH, which, again, that's fine, but I'm arguing there's some benefits to not doing that. I feel that's an important point. There's a whole separate thing here, like, we're not solving everything about Magic. We kind of only a little bit addressed power level, and another thing that I think has been a concern for my play group is that this may create unrealistically complicated board states. One major benefit of CEDH is that I think it's kind of impractical to avoid battle cruiser Magic otherwise, where there's just way too many things on everyone's board. Now, I have decks that from our playgroup, they're built with focused enough strategies that the idea is you can kind of understand my many cards on the board at a glance. I'm playing my Cadena deck, and so there's a lot of cards in play, but they're all just morph creatures that have flipped face up and now they don't do anything, they're just the body. Or they're morph enablers, like I have 2 cards that give all my stuff flash, so if you destroy both of those, I can't keep my engine going. And I've got Cadena, but also those 2 morphs, which we all know are just going to counterspell something. So that's how far you have to get through that, right? Like, after a few plays, the idea is that these decks are readable at a glance. They have a lot of redundancy. They don't play a lot of tutors. They play hardly any tutors because that forces you to play a good amount of redundancy, which is usually less efficient. You can't just play the most efficient spell. You don't even really have to restrict people from playing those spells necessarily. There might be some strategies where they're warranted. You get the idea. So it doesn't really address that. I think there's a whole battle cruiser magic thing that the beginning of my solution is to not use tutors and make decks relatively more redundant, but that might concern some people. They might feel like, well, that makes games really samey because you get a lot of the same effect all the time, but that's what tutors do as well. So anyway, that's a topic for another time. Very interesting topic, but a topic for another time. Let's see what PNGRZ said during their discussion and see how we did, shall we? I was going to do this earlier, but I was going and I thought I'd just go with it. So let's see what you said. PNGRZ says, during our discussion, the closest we could think of, remember the question was, are there any instances that can't upset someone, that cannot upset someone at a table in a game of Commander? The closest they could think of were things that are like the lace cycle from Alpha, plus moon lace and prismatic lace, since changing a singular spell or permanent's color, while still having some potential to change the course of the game, only extremely rarely does. Interesting. This is very different from the approach I took. It sounds to me like I might have been right that your playgroup feels the way I said with the less interaction angle, where if somebody gets targeted by a removal spell, they might feel picked on rather than just, that is what we've agreed to do. Which, by the way, it's not like wrong to feel picked on. There's no shame in feeling picked on. The solution would be to have a Rule 0 discussion or a different Rule 0 discussion. There's nothing to be ashamed of with that being a problem. I just wanted to make that clear. I would hate for someone to feel bad about feeling that way. I just think there is a solution, that's all. I felt that way, which is why I came up with all this. So by all means, like, I'm not saying that's bad or inherently childish, but I have had the experience of overcoming that thing, and that's what I wanted to recommend. It sounds like you're instead saying, what if you just play cards that are so ineffectual that they don't upset anyone? The problem then becomes they literally don't do anything, but they could. You could do something that's kind of the opposite, or the other flip side of the thing I suggested. Instead of playing inefficient removal, play very ineffectual, but very mana efficient effects. Things that don't do much, but they do it for a very low price or almost no price, which they often will because it's not like they don't know that changing a creature's color doesn't do much. You're then put in a position where, kind of like my model, you're going to probably need multiple cards to accomplish anything. You could play some card that like hoses one color. Well, that won't work because that's really efficient. I'm trying to think of like Moonlace, or you could play all mini combos, like destroy target tapped creature and tap target creature, and then you have both of them, and then you can kill a creature. But on their own, they don't do much. And maybe the destroy target tap creature is also pretty expensive. Anyway, you get the point, right? You could play all cards like that, where you can still interact with people, but you need to do it with a lot of spells instead. I feel like that wouldn't really solve the problem, because it sounds like what you're trying to say is any interaction does upset people in your playgroup, and I don't believe Magic can be fun if you feel that way. I'm not trying to be rude. That's just honestly what I think. So I don't know, but it does interest me to think about what if you had a way of playing Magic where you, right, like you just had to use a lot of cards to accomplish something. It was always very convoluted how you did it. It might make some play groups feel like it's earned when something is destroyed or something like that. I just don't, I don't know. I don't think that would last. I don't think that's a good solution. I think that would feel, eventually, once people optimize their decks enough, what you would do if you had to play cards like that is you'd build a hyper efficient value engine. You make some Simic value pile, green and blue mad card draw, but all of your actual interaction is individually bad. You just draw so much of it and play so much land. It will end up being exactly the same as the situation from before. People will just have, it might be a little worse actually, because people will have more efficient decks overall, which will get less interaction, even infinitely low interaction, but still some, will be drawn more often, which only exacerbates the problem I mentioned before. It will still be infrequent that interaction will come up, but it will still feel like a blowout. You'll just have to draw a bunch of cards to do it instead of one or something like that. I don't know. I mean, there can be some fun in playing cards like, I'm thinking of Zurin Orb, or like, what's that one card where you can sacrifice a mountain to, or a land to do 2 damage, or sacrifice discard a land to make a bear. Like those cards that wantonly destroy your resources, but they do some like moderately powerful repetitive effect. And in combo decks designed for them, those cards are really good. But if you played them in a deck that wasn't optimized to combo with them, they would be really inefficient, but they still do something. You could, I guess, play cards. Those are usually not instant speed, but you could play cards like that, and they might make people less salty just because you so flagrantly used your resources. Or here's another thing. Sometimes in the arms race of like having enough removal and stuff, you end up in a situation where eventually someone just forces you to use the thing. You have, you can sacrifice a forest to gain 3 life, and you've got like 10 forests. So no one attacks you because they know you could just sacrifice all your forests and gain 30 life. But then somebody goes, well, hold on. I mean, he can't just keep sacrificing all his forests to gain 30 life. So they attack you, and you have to pay the cost, and then that resource is kind of used up. Another thing that I think players do a lot that makes the interaction problem worse is they don't play into interaction, partially because they're thinking players have the really good interaction, but only a little bit of it. Do you see how if everyone knows that there's like 10 cards in your deck, everyone's deck has 10 cards that are going to stop you from doing a thing, there's no point in trying to play around it. Those players are just going to have to pick when to use it, which is much more interesting than everyone just kind of hoping they're not the unlucky one who gets hit with the 1 removal spell. I think I've said my bit about this. I'm very enthusiastic about this. I hope you can see I'm quite passionate about this subject, because I truly believe that it will make people have more fun playing Magic. If you try it or you don't think it will or something, that's fine. I vehemently disagree, but that's okay. Like, I don't want people to not have their fun. No one is here telling anyone their fun is wrong. I just think this might be more fun for most people. And I'm not convinced that the way that other ways of playing Magic are fun to people will last or are really enduring. Again, I really want to add this crucial footpoint that a lot of what happens is people say stuff like what I just said, and then the people on the other side of the conversation are going, but I literally am having fun when I play with my friends this way, so this person is wrong. And I want to highlight that what's probably happening is not that you're like not having real fun or something. You're just having fun for a reason other than how the Magic is going. That's my premise. It's not that I believe you are having fake fun. You know what I mean? Like, you know if you're having fun. I just think there could be more fun, and it's possible that Magic isn't the primary source of the fun. I personally have in the past few years gained a very low opinion of Magic the Gathering. I personally think that it is where I say that Buildcraft is about you doing the last little bit of game design to customize a game to your tastes as a player. Magic requires too much additional game design to be a good game. It's not fair to give Magic the credit for the critical mass of remaining development that the player has to do to make the game fun. There are many forms of Magic game development finishing that can be fun, lots of ways of playing Magic that are fun, but the player is doing like 20% of the game design at this point. Like, I'm not sure Magic gets that much of the credit anymore. That's how I've come to feel. The default ways of playing Magic are, in my opinion, not actually very good game design. People have fun playing them, but I personally think that they would have more fun playing a way that the developer hasn't promoted. And the players, with the most experience they can have, being the ones who play, have found ways to have more fun, to turn Magic into an almost different game that is, I truly believe, more fun. I really do think that this way of playing Commander tiny leaders, having reusable jumpstart booster packs, building a cube like a Winston draft cube. I really do think that those are the 4 most fun ways to play Magic, and they are the unofficial ways to play. And that I really do feel they're not just, I don't just like them more. I believe that they are superior game design to the ways that Magic is normally played, which I'm not saying is bad or good. I just feel like Magic has become a buyer beware for me. Like, you've got to be ready to get your hands dirty and design some game. So I've invited you to do that. I hope it kind of helps. I hope I didn't just shout about things that seemed irrelevant. I really do think this is worthwhile. I hope you give it a shot.